I believe this is the most important video I've ever done about wealth and XRP. Go ahead and like the video right now, subscribe if you haven't already, and let's jump in. There's one belief that keeps people from entering into real wealth, and you'll be shocked to find out what it is. I'm Kamilah Stevenson, and around here we talk wealth. And I want to talk about why most people believe that making money means selling something. See, that belief alone is why a lot of people will touch wealth once and then never keep it. Because when you actually study how long-term wealth behaves, you notice something very different. The people who end up with real control over their time, their lifestyle, and their legacy don't build their lives around exits. They build them around assets that keep working without being liquidated. And today, I want to walk you through something that keeps coming up around XRP, but usually in the wrong way. Most conversations focus on price, how high it can go, when to sell, where the top might be. That is not how capital thinks. What actually matters is what happens after an asset becomes valuable and what options open up once something stops being speculative and starts being structurally important. Because at that point, selling is rarely the most interesting move. And just so we're clear before we go further, this is not financial advice. I'm not telling you what to buy or sell. This is for educational purposes only. I just want to walk you through how I think about assets, liquidity, and wealth mechanics. Now, let's start with the foundation. One of the biggest misunderstandings in personal finance is the idea that income equals wealth. Income is very temporary and ownership is enduring. Liquidity feels powerful because it's visible. You can spend it, you can move it, you can show results. But liquidity is also very fragile. Once it's used, it's gone. Once it's taxed, it shrinks. And once it's spent, it has to be recreated. Ownership, on the other hand, works very differently. Ownership doesn't need to move to create value. It doesn't need to be converted to be useful, and it doesn't disappear just because you access its benefits. This is why wealthy individuals do not rush to sell appreciating assets, not because they're emotionally attached to them, because that's not the case, but it's really because they understand that selling collapses optionality. When you sell, you're making a permanent decision. You've chosen one outcome and eliminated every other possibility use of that asset going forward. That is retail behavior. That's not an insult. It's okay to sell sometimes and take a little cream off the top if you got the right game plan. But when I say it's retail behavior, I'm just saying it's a description of how most people are trained to think. Buy something, wait, sell it, and repeat. But once an asset reaches a certain scale, it stops being a trade and starts functioning like infrastructure on your personal balance sheet. At that point, the reasoning shouldn't be, how do I cash out? The reasoning should be, what does this asset allow me to do without giving it up? Because ownership gives you leverage. It gives you access. It gives you options that liquidity never will. Liquidity is a moment, but ownership is a position. And when people say things like, well, what's the point if you never sell? What they're really saying is they've only been taught one way money can work. Selling is just one function of an asset. It's often the least efficient one. Once you understand that, you can stop chasing all these exits and start designing systems. And that's where this conversation about XRP actually becomes interesting, not because of the price targets, but because of what is possible when ownership is preserved and liquidity is accessed in other ways. That is the shift that most people never make. And it's the difference between short-term gains and long-term financial independence. Now, I want to go through turning XRP into spendable power without selling, because now the goal isn't to convert assets into cash. The goal is to convert assets into access. This is where a lot of people get very uncomfortable, not because this is a complicated idea, but because it challenges how they've been conditioned to think. We're taught that the only way to enjoy the value of something is to sell it. Now, that's true if you're dealing with small assets. It's not true once assets reach scale. At scale, assets don't need to be sold to be useful. They need to be positioned. Think about how large institutions operate. They don't liquidate valuable holdings just to fund operations. They use those holdings as collateral. They borrow against them. They let the asset remain intact while liquidity does the work. The same principle applies here. When an asset is appreciating and widely acceptable as valuable, it can sit on the balance sheets and still provide spendable power. You're not extracting value by destroying ownership. You're extracting value by temporarily accessing liquidity. Now, this is a big distinction because when you sell, you trigger taxes, you lock in timing risk, you lose future upside, and you remove the asset from your financial ecosystem entirely. Now, speaking of taxes, this is also why I use a tax advantage structure. That matters because when assets are held inside something like a Roth IRA account, you're not just thinking about growth, you're thinking about preserving upside without future tax friction. That's why platforms that allow exposure inside retirement structures change how this compounds over time. I love iTrust Capital for that. And I just wanted to share that because this is a great way to not have to pay taxes on the asset as it appreciates. And I think that's powerful. Now, back to borrowing, because when you borrow, you do not trigger a tax event. A loan is not income, so it's not taxable. And also, when you borrow against it, it doesn't require you to give up ownership. And if the underlying asset continues to grow over time, the relative weight of that loan actually becomes lighter. This is why debt in the hands of disciplined asset holders behaves very differently than debt in the hands of consumers. Consumer debt funds lifestyle. Strategic debt funds systems. And this is where XRP stops being something you hope goes up and starts functioning like a balance sheet asset. If XRP reaches a point where it's broadly recognized as structurally important, meaning it's used, relied upon, integrated, then its role shifts. It's no longer something you just hold, it becomes something you can stand on. Liquidity sourced from an asset like that can be deployed intentionally, not recklessly, not emotionally, but intentionally. You can use it to acquire income producing businesses. You can use it to fund ventures that generate cash flow. You can use it to invest in systems that support your life without requiring constant attention. And the key point here is this: the asset stays intact the entire time. You're not dismantling the foundation to live in the house. You're using the foundation to support the structure above it. This is how people end up with lifestyles that don't look like they match their income, because income isn't the driver, access is. And over time, when assets continue to appreciate and borrowed capital is used productively, the entire structure starts feeding itself. This is not speculation. That is balance sheet mechanics. Once you understand this layer, you stop wanting to sell everything that's going to have great appreciation in the future, because selling becomes the least interesting option available to you. And this is only the first layer, because access alone isn't the end goal. The next question is what happens when the asset itself becomes productive? That's where things start compounding. So let's talk about making XRP productive without losing control. And this is for any asset that you're holding that has a bright future. At some point, holding an asset is no longer the most intelligent use of it. That doesn't mean you sell it. It means you stop letting it sit idle. There's a big difference between speculation and productivity. Speculation depends on timing. Productivity depends on structure. And when an asset becomes widely usable inside financial systems, it gains the ability to do work without being liquidated. This is where people tend to make mistakes because they hear words like yield or lending and immediately think risk. But productivity doesn't automatically mean recklessness. It simply means the asset is no longer passive. Think about how capital behaves in mature systems. Money doesn't sit still, it circulates, it provides liquidity, it supports transactions, and in exchange, it earns something for its availability. When XRP is used as part of settlement infrastructure, liquidity itself becomes valuable. Not ownership transfer, liquidity access. It's important to have distinction between the two. If institutions, payment rails, or financial systems need XRP temporarily to facilitate movement, then the value isn't just in holding it. The value is in allowing access to it under controlled conditions. That's where lending enters the picture, not as, again, a speculative gamble, but as a structural function. And I'm going to keep saying that because a lot of things have been speculative, but we got to understand when things transition from speculation to structural. Now, lending isn't about giving something away. It's about maintaining ownership while allowing temporary use. And when that use is tied to real economic activity, the asset starts generating return without being consumed. The same logic applies when XRP is extended into adjacent systems. You're not abandoning the asset, you're allowing it to participate in a broader financial environment. What matters here is intent. This isn't about chasing the highest return, it's about making capital functional while preserving control. It's about also choosing structures where the downside is understood and the upside is asymmetric. At that point, the asset becomes more than a store of value. It becomes working capital. And this is where the mindset shift deepens, because once an asset is both appreciating and productive, time starts working differently. You're no longer waiting for a price event to justify ownership. The asset is already justifying itself. This is also where discipline matters. Productive capital requires rules. Duration matters. Counterparty matters. Exposure matters. The goal isn't to squeeze every last percentage point. The goal is to keep the asset alive, intact, and useful. People who misunderstand this layer either avoid it completely or overreach. Neither approach builds longevity. But when done correctly, productivity adds a second dimension to wealth. Appreciation handles growth. Productivity handles sustainability. And once those two layers exist together, the conversation moves beyond income into systems. Because now you're not just accessing liquidity and earning return, you're setting up something that could support itself, which brings us to the part that most people never connect. What happens when borrowed liquidity, productive assets, and real world cash flow start reinforcing each other? That's where wealth stops being linear, and that's where the flywheel forms. This is the point where most financial conversations fall apart because people are taught to look at money in straight lines. You earn, you save, you invest, you sell. That's a linear model. It works if your goal is stability. It does not work if your goal is freedom. Wealth behaves in loops, not lines. When you understand that, you start going from how much does this make to what does this feed? Here's what that looks like structurally. You have an asset that retains ownership and continues to appreciate. That asset gives you access to liquidity without liquidation. That liquidity can be deployed into something that produces real cash flow, and that cash flow can support your life, reinvestment, or both. Nothing in that process requires you to dismantle the original asset. That is the flywheel. The mistake people make is thinking each step exists independently. In reality, each layer reinforces the next. Borrowed liquidity isn't the end goal, it's the bridge. Productivity isn't the end goal either, it's the stabilizer. Cash flow is where the system becomes livable. This is how people end up with lives that don't look fragile because their lifestyle isn't dependent on selling something at the right moment. It's supported by systems that keep moving whether markets are exciting or boring. And this is where XRP, if it reaches structural relevance, becomes more than a holding. It becomes a foundation. You don't need XRP to pay your bills directly. You need it to support the things that do. And that's the difference. Cash flow assets don't need to be flashy. They need to be dependable. Businesses, media platforms, real estate, licensing, equity stakes. Those are not exciting topics on social media, but they are what quietly fund freedom. When liquidity sourced from appreciating assets is deployed into cash flow systems, the entire equation changes. You're no longer working for money. Money is circulating to support the structure you design. And here's the part that most people miss. The flywheel doesn't need to spin fast to be effective. It needs to be stable. Stability allows patience. Patience allows compounding. Compounding allows time to do what effort never can. This is also where tax efficiency naturally enters the picture without turning the conversation into loopholes or these gimmicks. When capital is deployed into productive systems, expenses exist, depreciation exists, write-offs exist. None of that is the goal. It is a byproduct of structure. The real advantage is that your lifestyle is no longer tied to liquidation events. You don't need to time tops. You don't need to panic on pullbacks. You don't need constant market stimulation. You're operating from a position, not a trade. And once a flywheel exists, wealth becomes quieter, less reactive, less emotional, less urgent. That's when people move from thinking how rich they can get and start planning how long they can stay free. And actually, one of the personal moves that I made as I started to think long term was getting a lot of my crypto off the exchanges and planning more intentionally around custody and execution. This was all because I started thinking more long term versus temporary. When you're dealing with size and you are trying to allocate some of your money into other assets, then slippage is going to matter. Execution is going to matter, and having discretion is going to matter too. And that's very different from clicking buy or sell on a retail platform. And that's why I chose to work very closely with an OTC desk. I use Caleb and Brown because you get a personal broker. Your orders are handled directly. And I love that. You're not dealing with the same friction and slippage that you see on the exchanges. So if you start getting very serious about planning your long-term wealth building capabilities, then this is something you may want to consider. For me, it was just about preparation. It's about building systems before you need them instead of reacting after the fact. And most people approach wealth very reactively. I'm thinking much more strategically about how everything is structured. So if you want to learn more about Caleb and Brown and how it works, I'll leave a link in the description, which leads me to a very important point. I want you to know this conversation is not random. It's really me trying to get you to really see the bigger picture. Too many people are operating on a very temporary time frame. They are not thinking long term. They are not thinking about the future. They are not thinking about generational wealth. They are thinking about right now. And when you think about it, that's childlike behavior. They're buying things that they can't even afford right now. But when it comes to trying to structure a wealth building process, they don't want to pay attention to this. If you're still here listening, I know that you are somebody who is serious about your future. And so this conversation is for you because we're dealing with a different environment right now. And the way you set this up is either going to hurt you or it's going to bless you. Now, let me share this important piece about where we are in the environment and again, why this matters. When you see regulators, institutions, and infrastructure bodies suddenly paying attention to the same class of assets at the same time, it's not because they become curious, it's because something in the existing framework is no longer efficient enough to support what's coming next. Liquidity stress exposes weakness. Settlement delays expose inefficiencies. Regulatory confusion exposes outdated assumptions. That's when alternatives stop being theoretical and start being evaluated seriously. And this is where a lot of people get distracted by all the headlines. I'm trying to sober you. They focus on enforcement, actions, court cases, legislation, and statements without stepping back to ask why these conversations are happening at all. Financial systems do not redesign themselves unless they have to. When infrastructure becomes the topic, it's usually because the old infrastructure cannot keep up with scale, speed, or complexity. That's when assets tied to settlement, liquidity, and movement start being viewed differently than assets that exist purely for speculation. This is why timing matters, not for trading, but for understanding. If an asset moves from the margins into the conversation around infrastructure, regulation, and integration, its role changes. It's no longer just something that people hold. It becomes something systems account for. And when systems account for something, ownership starts to matter more than excitement. That is why this conversation around XRP have evolved, not because everyone suddenly agrees and not because the price has already done what people expect, because we know it hasn't, but because the context around money itself is shifting. This is also why the question of how do you make money becomes incomplete. The more relevant question becomes how assets function inside a changing system. Do it sit idle? Do they require constant exits? Or do they support liquidity, access, and continuity? Those distinctions are very subtle, but they're very decisive. When systems are stable, speculation dominates. But when systems are stressed, structure matters. And we're clearly in a period where structure matters more than height. Listen to me here. If you don't get anything else, understand that wealth isn't built by being right once. is built by designing systems that don't depend on perfect timing. Selling has its place, liquidity has its place, profit taking has its place, but those are tools, those are not strategies. When people build their entire financial life around exits, they stay reactive. When they build around ownership, access, and structure, they gain control. Assets are not lottery tickets, they're leverage points. And once you understand how to preserve ownership while accessing liquidity, productivity, and cash flow, money stops being something you chase and starts being something you manage. That is the difference between reacting to markets and positioning within them. Now, if you do want to learn how this works in a structured way, not hype, not all the noise, then that's what Stock Up University is for. And that is where you're going to learn long-term investing, asset behavior, and financial literacy from a systems-based perspective. And for those who want to go deeper with real positioning and help applying this in real time, that's what my coaching program is designed for. We're going to build out a blueprint for you, help you with your portfolio, and help you to make sense of where you're headed with your financial freedom goals. Now, if this conversation resonated with you and you care more about long-term control rather than short-term excitement, then make sure you give it a thumbs up and you do subscribe so that you don't miss my next video. Also, give me a comment and tell me, what do you think about everything that we talked about? I want to hear from you. I want to hear what your plans are, what your goals are. And if you got anything to add, I always look at the comments. I would love to hear from you. I want to continue to empower this community to just have clear thinking around wealth, systems, and how capital actually works. And as always, I want you to stay wise, stay wealthy, and I'll see you in the next video.